You know how the Crimson Claw Syndicate pirates were the most feared in the galaxy? They boarded the Steady Eddie expecting an easy hijacking. But they never planned on an 8-year-old human girl and her emotional support honey badger. Captain Scar's demand to surrender turned into the biggest miscalculation in interstellar crime history. So how exactly did a child and a predator rewrite galactic engagement rules? This is the story that forced the Federation to classify human cubs as supernovas with abandonment issues. You know how some assignments feel like a punishment detail? After 30 years of Federation service that included border skirmishes and 3 diplomatic evacuations, Captain Rex Murphy found himself assigned to escort duty on the Steady Eddie. The ship itself was a retired cargo hauler, all worn plating and outdated systems, barely holding together for one last run. His mission: transport one 8-year-old human girl and her emotional support animal across 3 sectors. For a man who'd commanded destroyers, this felt less like an assignment and more like career hospice. His crew took it in stride. Blubbert, the gelatinous cook whose species reproduced by binary fission, saw it as light duty between proper meals. Squakes, the engineer with too many limbs, enjoyed the simple mechanics of an old ship that didn't demand constant diagnostics. They treated the human child like any other cargo that happened to need occasional feeding and supervision. Standard Federation protocol classified minors as passive cargo anyway, requiring temperature-controlled environments and minimal interaction. But Rex had served near human colonies before. He'd seen what their children could do. While Blubbert worried about meal schedules and Squakes checked atmosphere seals, Rex watched the girl, Mika, with the caution most captains reserved for unstable warp cores. She moved through the ship like she owned it, asking questions about navigation systems that Federation children wouldn't understand for another decade. Her curiosity had weight to it, a focused intensity that made Rex's neck prickle. The cultural divide became clear within hours. Where Rex saw potential system tampering, Blubbert saw a child who might be hungry. Where Squakes noted optimal cargo containment, Rex noted a small human measuring emergency hatch dimensions. Federation protocols treated young passengers as fragile objects to be preserved. But human child rearing apparently produced tiny investigators who treated safety protocols as personal challenges. Mika's animal stayed close to her, a low-slung terrestrial mammal that watched everything with flat black eyes. The emotional support designation seemed to cover a creature that moved with unsettling purpose through the ship's corridors. Rex tolerated the arrangement, but his experience told him that anything involving human children came with hidden variables. The manifest said 1 8-year-old and 1 small animal. His instinct said something else entirely. This routine escort mission masked a reality nobody had accounted for. Rex's reluctance wasn't about babysitting. It was the veteran's understanding that when humans label something emotional support, they might be understating the situation considerably. Which brings us to why this particular transport drew very specific attention from the wrong kind of people. You know how some passengers are more than they appear? Mika Rodriguez traveled with an escort detail and paperwork that marked her as low-priority transit, but the pirates who swarmed the Steady Eddie weren't there for the ship or its crew. Their boarding party cut straight to the command deck and Captain Scar himself made the demand. Not for cargo, not for credits, but for the child by name. That specificity changed everything. This wasn't opportunistic piracy. It was the extraction mission with a single objective. Mika's parents, Elena and Carlos Rodriguez, were xenobiologists working at the cutting edge of adaptive bioengineering. They weren't just academics. They held clearance levels that put their research under Federation security lockouts. Organized crime syndicates like the Crimson Claw often target scientists, not for ransom but for access. A researcher's knowledge can be worth more than any shipment of ore or tech, especially when that knowledge involves proprietary biological adaptations or terraforming applications. Somebody leaked the transport route. The precision of the attack suggested inside information. Someone knew which ship, which route, and exactly who was on board. That kind of intel doesn't come from scanning cargo manifests. It comes from paid informants or compromised officials. The pirates moved with the confidence of a team that knew resistance would be minimal, the payload valuable, and the Federation response slow. Their interest in a child signaled something beyond ordinary kidnapping. Kids aren't typical high-value targets unless they're connected to something bigger. Research lineages, genetic legacy, or in this case, possibly first-hand exposure to their parents' work. Maybe Mika had seen things, heard things, or even inherited something her parents were studying. The Crimson Claw didn't just want a hostage. They wanted a resource. The hijacking turned personal the moment Scar ignored the ship, the crew, the command codes, and zeroed in on an 8-year-old girl. That focus betrayed a deeper agenda. Kidnapping a child from a moving starship isn't a casual operation. It takes planning, coordination, and a willingness to burn assets. Somebody wanted the Rodriguez legacy badly enough to send the most feared pirates in the sector. But the pirates made one critical miscalculation about their target. They saw a child and assumed vulnerability. They saw a small animal and assumed insignificance. They'd prepared for Federation security protocols, military response patterns, even potential drone defenses. They hadn't prepared for the particular combination of human curiosity and terrestrial predator instincts. Their intel was good, just not good enough. You know how humans form unusual bonds with Earth creatures. Nibbles wasn't your standard emotional support animal. Mika introduced him to the crew with the kind of pride most kids reserve for winning science fairs or beating video games. She explained he helped her process big emotions and adapt to new environments, which sounded like therapy speak, until you watched them move together through the ship's corridors. The animal matched her pace exactly, his low center of gravity and deliberate movements suggesting something more functional than emotional. The crew reacted with predictable skepticism. Blubbard offered nutrient paste, assuming any terrestrial mammal would prioritize feeding. Squakes ran scans that registered basic biological functions and nothing more. But Mika's confidence in her companion carried weight. She spoke of Nibbles like he was a partner in her daily explorations, not a comfort object. When Rex asked about the creature's origins, her answer shifted the atmosphere on the bridge. Her father found Nibbles on an outer rim research station that specialized in apex predator studies. Not domestic animal research, not companion species, predators. The facility studied survival adaptations in extreme environments, and Nibbles came from a line of creatures bred for resilience testing. Honey badgers already possessed remarkable biological traits: thick, loose skin that resisted bites, powerful digging claws, and a metabolic tolerance for toxins that would kill most species. The research station had been documenting their problem-solving capabilities under controlled conditions. The emotional support designation masked a deeper partnership. Humans have this tendency to label dangerous things with harmless names, like calling a territorial protection animal an emotional support creature. Nibbles didn't just provide comfort. He provided capabilities. His presence meant Mika could navigate unfamiliar environments with a companion whose instincts operated on entirely different parameters than human or Federation norms. This creature's origins pointed toward capabilities far beyond conventional pet status. Laboratory notes from the research station documented honey badgers opening secured containers, bypassing simple locks, and demonstrating spatial reasoning that rivaled some intelligent species. Their fear response was notably absent. Instead, they showed curiosity and persistence when confronted with obstacles. These weren't pets. They were compact survival experts with industrial-grade tools attached to their paws. Nibbles represented something far more dangerous than paperwork suggested. His diplomatic status as an emotional support animal granted him passage rights usually reserved for sentient beings, but his actual function blended guardian, tool, and strategic asset. The Federation's classification systems had no category for a terrestrial predator that could serve as both psychological support and physical security. Which brings us to how the galaxy fundamentally misunderstands human-animal relationships. Most species keep pets for companionship or utility. Humans sometimes keep predators and call them family. They develop bonds with creatures that other civilizations would classify as hazardous materials, then act surprised when those creatures defend their humans with evolutionary efficiency. The Crimson Claw Syndicate assumed they were boarding a ship with a child and a pet. They were about to learn the difference between documentation and reality. You know how pirates operate with overwhelming force? The Crimson Claw Syndicate didn't bother with subtlety when they swarmed the Steady Eddy. 6 armored boarders materialized on the bridge, weapons humming with energy signatures that outdated the ship's entire defensive suite. Their breach charges left scorch marks across the bulkheads, and their movements screamed professional efficiency. Captain Scar's transmission cut through the emergency channels with the casual confidence of someone who'd done this 100 times before. Cut engines, prepare for boarding, standard pirate rhetoric delivered like he was ordering lunch. Against a retired cargo hauler with no military upgrades, it should have been a textbook operation. Rex faced the kind of math that breaks most commanders. 6 trained pirates with modern gear against 3 crew members whose best weapon was a maintenance plasma torch. The Steady Eddie's defensive capabilities amounted to basic radiation shielding and a hull thick enough to withstand micrometeorites. Retired cargo haulers like this one typically get stripped of anything resembling weaponry before civilian service. Their security systems were designed to deter stowaways, not combat troops. Conventional defense wasn't an option. It was suicide. Scar's attention immediately found Mika. He called her sweetheart in that condescending tone adults use when they think children are decorative accessories. His focus remained on Rex, on the ship's controls, on the predictable elements of space combat. The pirates secured the bridge, checked for hidden crew members, ran standard scans for weapons. They followed boarding protocols designed for dealing with armed resistance or hiding spots. Their training covered every conventional scenario from hostage situations to last-stand firefights. What they didn't account for was the small human child watching them with detached curiosity, or the low-slung terrestrial predator that hadn't moved from her side. The invaders were professionals executing a routine boarding operation against inferior forces. Their threat assessment algorithms would have calculated crew numbers, weapon signatures, defensive capabilities. Those algorithms don't have variables for 8-year-old girls who treat armed invasions like interactive educational experiences. The hijacking transformed in that moment from piracy to something else entirely. This wasn't about capturing a ship anymore. It became about the fundamental miscalculation of treating human children as passive cargo. The pirates saw a vulnerable biological specimen they needed to transport intact. They failed to recognize the cognitive capabilities staring back at them, or the evolutionary partnership standing silently at her feet. Their focus remained on the conventional threats, the adult crew, the ship systems, the potential hidden defenses. But the pirates were about to learn what they'd actually boarded. Their intelligence told them about a retired cargo hauler, a burned-out captain, and a high-value child target. It failed to mention that the child came packaged with a predator, whose evolutionary history revolved around solving problems by dismantling them. They'd prepared for military resistance, not for the particular combination of human curiosity and honey badger persistence. Their boarding operation was about to encounter a threat model that didn't exist in any pirate training manual. You know, how children react differently under pressure. While armed pirates secured the bridge with professional efficiency, Mika Rodriguez remained perfectly still beside her honey badger. She didn't cry, didn't hide behind the captain's chair, didn't do any of the things the pirates expected from a child facing invasion. Instead, she studied the borders with the focused attention of a technician diagnosing a malfunction. Her voice cut through the tension on the bridge with unsettling clarity. "Should I be worried about these men?" she asked Rex as if consulting a manual for proper procedure. Rex responded with a calm that surprised even himself. "Not unless they try to separate you from Nibbles," he said, his eyes locking with hers. In that moment, he recognized this wasn't a hostage situation anymore. It had become a field test of human adaptability under stress. His 30 years of service included encounters with dozens of species, but human children operated on entirely different psychological parameters. Where most beings would panic, they often shifted into problem-solving mode. Captain Scar attempted to maintain control of the situation, his weapon still trained on Rex. He told Mika to stay quiet, using that universal adult tone meant to establish authority over children. But human children, especially those raised by scientists, don't respond to authority the way other species do. Mika's parents had encouraged her curiosity, taught her to question everything, nurtured the very traits that made her unpredictable in crisis situations. She met Scar's command not with obedience but with analytical silence. Human children in extreme circumstances often demonstrate cognitive flexibility that surpasses adult capabilities. Their brains haven't yet hardened into predictable response patterns. Faced with novel threats, they can assess, adapt, and innovate in ways that trained professionals might overlook. Mika wasn't calculating risk versus reward. She was mapping possibilities. Her education hadn't just covered mathematics and science. It included practical problem-solving games her parents developed from xenobiology research. Meanwhile, Nibbles displayed an uncanny stillness that signaled something beyond animal fear. Most creatures would show agitation when surrounded by armed strangers, raised hackles, nervous movement, defensive postures. The honey badger simply watched, his black eyes tracking each pirate's position. His body coiled with patient readiness. This wasn't the paralysis of fear. This was the stillness of a predator assessing opportunities. His evolutionary history didn't include retreat as an option, only assessment and action. The pirates' miscalculation began unfolding in real time. They'd prepared for resistance from trained personnel, for security systems, for military protocols. They hadn't prepared for a child who treated their invasion as an interesting puzzle, or for a terrestrial predator that viewed armed borders as environmental factors to be managed. Their threat assessment models contained variables for weapons, armor, training, and technology. They had no parameters for curiosity paired with evolutionary persistence. They weren't dealing with a vulnerable child, but a strategist operating on fundamentally different psychological frameworks. The pirates assumed kidnapping a child would be simpler than extracting a trained adult. They thought fear would make her compliant, that confusion would make her passive. Instead, they encountered a mind that saw their invasion not as a threat, but as a systems integration challenge. Their conventional tactics were about to collide with unconventional problem-solving, which brings us to the moment the honey badger doctrine became relevant. You know how most creatures have a flight response? Honey badgers literally don't understand the concept of retreat.
As the pirates trained their weapons on the bridge crew, Rex Murphy decided to educate them.
He kept his voice calm, almost conversational, explaining the ecological background of the creature standing beside the human child. This wasn't a pet, he told them. This was a terrestrial predator from a death world where backing down meant dying. The explanation hung in the air, reshaping the entire confrontation in real time. You could see the psychological shift ripple through the boarding party. Their weapons remained aimed, but their attention divided between the human crew and the small animal they'd dismissed as cargo. Where they'd seen a biological curiosity, they now saw something else entirely. An apex predator whose evolutionary history revolved around solving problems with claws and teeth. Their training covered hostile fauna, but always as environmental hazards, never as tactical opponents. Terran honey badgers operate on a completely different threat response system than most species. Where other animals calculate risk versus reward, honey badgers assess obstacles versus opportunities. Their neural pathways don't process retreat as a viable option, only forward movement, only engagement. Real honey badgers back on Earth demonstrate extraordinary fearlessness, confronting animals 10 times their size and showing problem-solving abilities that rival some primates. They've been documented opening complex latches, coordinating attacks with other predators, and persevering through injuries that would incapacitate most creatures. This particular creature's evolutionary background made him ideally suited for shipboard combat. His low center of gravity provided stability during maneuvering. His powerful claws could find purchase on metal surfaces that would defeat most terrestrial animals. His loose, thick skin offered protection against energy weapon grazes and physical attacks. But most importantly, his brain processed confined spaces not as limitations but as complex environments to be mastered. Where the pirates saw corridors and bulkheads, Nibbles saw three-dimensional puzzle space. The pirates began understanding they'd triggered something irreversible. Their weapons were designed to intimidate thinking beings who understood consequences. They worked against soldiers who valued self-preservation, against civilians who feared injury, against creatures programmed for survival instincts. None of their training accounted for an opponent whose fundamental operating system lacked the retreat subroutine. You can't threaten something that doesn't comprehend the concept of surrender. Nibbles wasn't just an animal. He was a weapon forged by millions of years of evolutionary pressure. His species didn't develop fear responses because their survival strategy revolved around confronting threats, until those threats stopped moving. Their neural architecture prioritizes persistence over preservation, problem-solving over flight. They assess, adapt, and engage, always forward, never back. The honey badger doctrine isn't about winning. It's about continuing. But understanding came too late for the boarding party. Their realization dawned just as Nibbles shifted from observational stillness to purposeful movement. The psychological advantage they'd held moments before evaporated, replaced by the dawning comprehension that they weren't dealing with predictable fauna, but with evolutionary perfection. Their weapons suddenly felt inadequate against a creature that viewed energy projectors as interesting puzzles, rather than threats. The bridge, which moments before had been a controlled capture scenario, transformed into an ecosystem with a new apex predator. You know how children can focus with intense precision? Mika Rodriguez transformed from passenger to tactical planner in the space between heartbeats. While the pirates maintained their weapon discipline and Rex calculated survival odds, the 8-year-old slipped into the navigation station she'd been studying since boarding. Her small hands moved across controls designed for adult operators, her attention narrowing to the ship schematic glowing on the display. She didn't ask permission or wait for orders. She simply began calling targets and routes with commander's authority, her voice cutting through the tension like a laser through hull plating. The seasoned pirates struggled to comprehend what was happening. Their training covered hostage situations, armed resistance, even civilian panic. Nothing prepared them for a child directing military operations with the calm precision of a veteran officer. Human children, when empowered by curiosity and proper support, become unexpected force multipliers. Their cognitive flexibility allows them to process information in ways adult brains often filter out through experience and caution. Where adults see limitations, children see possibilities. Child cognition often excels at pattern recognition and unconventional problem-solving. Mika's parents hadn't just taught her xenobiology. They'd engaged her in complex puzzle games that required spatial reasoning and adaptive thinking. She processed the ship's layout not as fixed architecture, but as interconnected systems with vulnerabilities and opportunities. Her commands to Nibbles weren't random suggestions but specific instructions based on observed patterns of pirate movement and ship infrastructure. Mika's confidence grew from her partnership with Nibbles, creating a feedback loop of effectiveness. Each successful maneuver the honey badger executed reinforced her strategic decisions. Where the pirates saw a child talking to an animal, they were actually witnessing a command structure operating on entirely different principles. Her directions accounted for Nibbles's capabilities in ways no adult commander could replicate. She understood his physical limitations, his persistence thresholds, his particular methods of solving physical obstacles. The coordination between child and animal began systematically dismantling the invasion. Mika would identify a vulnerability, a weakly secured hatch, a poorly guarded corridor, a critical system access point, and Nibbles would implement the solution with brutal efficiency. They operated as a single tactical unit, with the child providing strategic oversight and the animal handling field operations. The pirates found themselves responding to threats they couldn't predict from directions they hadn't secured. Mika became the unexpected general of a conflict that defied conventional military doctrine. Her age, which the pirates had assumed would make her passive and easily controlled, actually provided tactical advantages. She didn't think in terms of standard engagement protocols or acceptable risk calculations. She saw the ship as an ecosystem and the invasion as an imbalance to be corrected. Her commands focused on creating systemic disruption rather than direct confrontation. The pirates kept waiting for adult intervention, for professional military tactics, for the predictable patterns of space combat they'd trained to counter. Instead, they faced an 8-year-old who treated their boarding operation like an interactive puzzle game with real-world consequences. Their weapons remained trained on the adult crew, while the actual threat operated outside their understanding of how conflicts should unfold. Which brings us to the honey badger's implementation of her plans. You know how ships have secure areas? Nibbles treated bulkheads as suggestions rather than barriers. The pirates had locked down the interior hatches according to standard boarding protocols, creating secure zones where they could control movement and defend positions. They'd sealed engine rooms, armories, and command areas with magnetic locks that could withstand plasma cutters and brute force. Standard pirate doctrine assumed opponents would need tools, explosives, or security overrides to breach these partitions. They didn't account for a terrestrial predator with evolutionary adaptations for penetrating hardened surfaces. The honey badger began moving through solid partitions with methodical determination. His claws evolved for digging through termite mounds and root systems, found microscopic imperfections in metal seams. His powerful shoulder muscles, designed for breaking into hardened animal burrows, applied focused pressure at precise points. Where the pirates saw secured hatches, Nibbles saw puzzle interfaces to be solved through application of force and ingenuity. Internal ship systems that should have been protected became vulnerable to the creature's movements. You know how legends grow from unexpected sources? Mika and Nibbles became cautionary icons across the galaxy without ever seeking the attention. The story circulated through pirate networks as a warning, through military academies as a case study, through diplomatic channels as cultural briefing material. What began as routine transport paperwork became foundational to interstellar engagement doctrine within a standard fiscal quarter. The incident demonstrated that human ingenuity could consistently overcome technological superiority when operating outside conventional parameters. Underdog stories often become foundational to organizational culture and training because they reveal vulnerabilities in established systems. Military strategists incorporated the Steady Eddie incident into curriculum, not as anomaly but as pattern recognition exercise. Security forces developed training scenarios that emphasized unconventional threat assessment over technological superiority. The honey badger's refusal to retreat became metaphorical for human resilience in face of overwhelming opposition. This narrative shifted from anecdote to principle, a working model for how determination could destabilize even the most confident aggressors. This legacy would influence countless future interactions and decisions across multiple sectors. Merchant captains adjusted insurance premiums for routes carrying human passengers. Security firms developed specialized assessment protocols for terrestrial animals. Border control stations implemented non-confrontational screening procedures that minimized direct engagement with human children. The changes weren't just procedural, they represented a fundamental shift in how the galaxy assessed risk and capability. Their story became operational guidance because it provided a framework for understanding human behavioral patterns. The Federation's updated manuals included psychological profiles on human developmental stages, alongside technical specifications for weapon systems. Military planners started considering cognitive flexibility as tactical factor, rather than just counting ships and guns. The honey badger's persistence became shorthand for unpredictable resilience in tactical simulations. How did a child and honey badger become legends? By demonstrating that conventional power assessment missed critical variables. Their story proved that technological superiority meant little against opponents who didn't follow predictable engagement patterns. The legend grew because it wasn't about extraordinary capabilities but about ordinary human traits applied in extraordinary circumstances. Curiosity, persistence, and creative problem-solving became recognized as legitimate strategic factors rather than personality quirks. The narrative endured because it contained universal truths about underestimation and adaptation. Pirate organizations used it to train new recruits about the dangers of assumptions. Military academies taught it as object lesson in threat assessment blind spots. Diplomatic corps referenced it when explaining human cultural peculiarities to confused alien governments. The story worked because it was specific enough to be memorable, but flexible enough to apply to various situations. Which brings us to why this matters today. The Steady Eddie incident didn't just change policies, it changed perceptions. Human children are now approached with cautious respect rather than dismissive familiarity. Terrestrial animals receive careful assessment, rather than automatic classification as pets. The galaxy learned that cornering human cubs meant facing not just the child, but humanity's entire evolutionary heritage of creativity and persistence. Some lessons only need to be learned once if they're learned properly. The galaxy learned that cornering a human cub means facing their entire evolutionary heritage, and sometimes their honey badger. So the next time you see a human child traveling through space, maybe just smile politely and keep walking. Some lessons only get learned once, but they get learned permanently. That 8-year-old and her companion rewrote interstellar engagement protocols through sheer persistence and creative problem-solving. Now security forces maintain respectful distances and pirates avoid certain transports altogether. One incident shifted galactic policy forever. The moral's simple: never underestimate small packages. Earth's children travel with hidden backups. Honey badger anatomy and determination allow for extraordinary penetration capabilities. Their claws aren't just defensive weapons. They're precision tools capable of applying immense force to small surface areas. Their teeth can exert pressure that cracks bone and tears through reinforced materials. But most importantly, their problem-solving intelligence enables them to identify structural weaknesses that mechanical tools might overlook. They don't just force entry. They find the path of least resistance through apparently solid barriers. Real honey badgers back on Earth demonstrate this capability regularly. They've been documented digging through concrete foundations, breaking into secured food containers, and penetrating hardened animal enclosures. Their persistence is legendary. They'll work at a barrier for hours, testing different approaches until they find one that works. Zoologists have recorded them solving complex latch mechanisms and even coordinating with other animals to bypass obstacles. Their intelligence is specifically geared toward overcoming physical barriers. Ship designers never accounted for terrestrial predators with such destructive potential. Starship security protocols were developed around intelligent opponents using technology, not animals using evolutionary adaptations. Bulkhead thickness calculations considered plasma weapons and shaped charges, not claws and teeth applying sustained pressure to stress points. Security audits evaluated electronic countermeasures and hacking vulnerabilities, not biological persistence. The entire concept of ship defense assumed rational actors following predictable patterns of attack. The pirates' own security measures became irrelevant against this threat. Their locked hatches, secured compartments, and defensive positions assumed they controlled the battlefield geometry. They'd trained to defend choke points and covered approaches. None of their preparations accounted for an opponent that could create new entrances through walls, floors, and ceilings. Their tactical advantage evaporated, as Nibbles demonstrated that any partition could become a door given sufficient determination and the right anatomical tools. Nibbles bypassed all conventional defenses by operating outside the parameters of Starship combat doctrine. While the pirates watched doors and corridors, he moved through ventilation shafts, service conduits, and even created his own passages where necessary. His progress wasn't limited by the ship's designed circulation patterns. He treated the entire vessel as raw material to be reconfigured according to his needs. The concept of secure areas lost meaning when the security perimeter could be breached from any direction at any time, but accessing their ship was only the beginning. You know how pirates rely on their technology? Nibbles began dismantling their advantages systematically. The invaders watched their tactical superiority evaporate as a terrestrial predator treated their advanced systems as interesting puzzles. Life support controls that maintained perfect atmospheric balance became targets for the honey badger's attention. He didn't smash panels or tear wires randomly. His approach showed methodical precision that bypassed safeties and created targeted disruptions. The pirates found themselves dealing with fluctuating oxygen levels and temperature spikes that their environmental suits couldn't compensate for. Weapon systems suffered similar fates. Energy rifle charging ports got clogged with whatever debris Nibbles could find. Magazine releases jammed with careful applications of pressure at precisely the wrong points. Communication consoles lost critical connections as cables suffered subtle damage that took technicians precious minutes to diagnose. The honey badger exhibited remarkable problem-solving skills with mechanical systems, demonstrating an understanding of cause and effect that went beyond animal instinct. His actions weren't random vandalism. They were tactical disables. The environmental control disruptions created specific hazards for the pirate crew. Atmosphere processors began cycling through unpredictable gas mixtures that triggered respiratory distress in some species. Gravity plates fluctuated between standard and crushing weights without warning. Lighting systems flickered through seizure-inducing patterns that made aiming weapons nearly impossible. These weren't system failures. They were recalibrations that turned the ship's own infrastructure against its occupants. The pirates' technological edge became their greatest liability as their systems turned hostile. Weapon disables occurred with surgical precision. Nibbles would target the weakest point in each system: the cooling vent on an energy projector, the power cell connection on a plasma rifle, the sighting mechanism on a sniper system. He neutralized threats without destroying equipment, suggesting an understanding of functional mechanics that shouldn't exist in a non-sentient creature. Each disabled weapon represented another, pirate forced to rely on secondary arms or hand-to-hand combat against an opponent that specialized in close quarters engagement. The boarding operations balance of power shifted minute by minute. Where the pirates had initially controlled the ship through technological superiority and numerical advantage, they now found themselves fighting their own environment. Their comm systems crackled with confused reports of systems failing simultaneously across multiple decks. Their tactical display showed areas going dark not because of enemy action, but because something was systematically dismantling the sensor network. They were losing visibility, losing communication, losing environmental control, all to a creature that weighed less than most of their sidearms. The pirates' equipment became liabilities instead of assets. Every powered system represented a potential vulnerability that the honey badger could exploit. Their armor's climate control could malfunction and overheat. Their helmet displays could flicker and distort. Their weapon targeting systems could develop calibration errors at critical moments. They found themselves increasingly abandoning technology and relying on basic senses, which put them at even greater disadvantage against an opponent whose primary senses were honed by millions of years of terrestrial evolution. What happened when Nibbles got loose inside the pirate ship was the systematic unraveling of technological warfare. The pirates trained to fight opponents who used similar technology, followed similar tactics, operated within similar parameters. They weren't prepared for an adversary that treated their advanced systems as mechanical puzzles to be solved through application of claws and persistence. Their assumption that technological superiority guaranteed victory collapsed when facing a creature that didn't need technology to be effective, which brings us to the moment the pirates realized their situation. You know how military organizations have emergency codes? The pirates frantically declared a Code 7 situation. Their transmission crackled across the command channels with a tone of disbelief that no training could prepare you for. We have a Code 7 situation. Somehow an 8-year-old human and her pet have taken tactical control. That admission represented more than just a status update. It was the complete collapse of their operational confidence. Professional soldiers don't panic easily, but hearing that particular combination of words over official channels would make anyone question reality. Military and paramilitary organizations use coded status reports specifically to maintain composure during crises. These systems allow units to communicate severe situations without triggering wider panic. Code 7 typically represents complete loss of operational control to unexpected or non-standard factors. It's the classification you use when circumstances have deviated so far from established parameters that standard protocols no longer apply. Most soldiers go entire careers without hearing a Code 7 declaration. The psychological impact of that admission was devastating. These were professionals from the Crimson Claw Syndicate, known for their discipline and effectiveness across 3 sectors. They'd trained for years to handle everything from shipboard fires to mutinies to Federation Marine counterboarding operations. Their confidence came from knowing they could outthink and outfight any conventional opponent. Having to acknowledge that a child and animal had outmaneuvered them struck at the core of their professional identity. The pirates' confidence collapsed as their own protocols documented their failure. Using the Code 7 designation meant this wasn't just a temporary setback. It was formal recognition that their understanding of the situation had been fundamentally wrong. Their training had covered hostage scenarios, armed resistance, equipment failures, even psychological warfare. None of their manuals contained procedures for dealing with a tactical partnership between a curious child and a persistent predator. The very act of declaring the code forced them to confront the absurdity of their position. They'd been tactically outmaneuvered by opponents operating outside all established combat doctrine. The Code 7 situation represented more than just losing control of the ship. It meant losing control of the narrative. These weren't soldiers being defeated by superior forces. They were professionals being systematically dismantled by a problem their entire worldview couldn't accommodate. Their weapons were useless, their tactics irrelevant, their experience meaningless against this particular combination of threats. What made the Code 7 declaration so devastating was its formal nature. This wasn't panic in the heat of battle. It was a calibrated admission of defeat using their own professional terminology. The pirates were following procedure even in their failure, which somehow made the situation more humiliating. They weren't just losing. They were documenting their loss according to standard operating protocols. creating an official record that would follow them forever. The admission that a child and animal had taken tactical control wasn't just embarrassing, it was institutionally devastating. Military organizations rely on certain assumptions about how conflicts work, about what constitutes a threat, about the relationship between technology and effectiveness. The Code 7 declaration meant all those assumptions had proven false. They weren't just losing a boarding operation. They were watching their entire professional framework collapse around them. But the humiliation was only beginning. You know how pirates value their flagships? Nibble's priority target became the command vessel itself. While the boarding party remained distracted on the Steady Eddie, the Honey Badger identified the real center of power, the pirate mothership hanging in the darkness beyond the viewports. Mika declared it the primary objective with the casual certainty of someone choosing which game to play next. Her instruction wasn't a suggestion. It was strategic designation of the operational center of gravity. The pirates had come to capture a ship, but their own vessel was about to become the prize. The Honey Badger breached the command ship's defenses while the pirates struggled to respond. Their anti-boarding protocols were designed for organized assaults, not for a single terrestrial predator treating their hull like an interesting surface to explore. External sensors detected movement but classified it as space debris or sensor ghosting. Their systems weren't programmed to recognize a honey badger climbing across vacuum-rated metal. By the time they realized what was happening, Nibbles had already found a maintenance hatch and demonstrated that exterior locks were just another type of puzzle. Taking control of the flagship represented complete reversal of the boarding operation's purpose. The pirates had intended to seize a civilian vessel and its valuable passenger. Instead, they found their own command ship being systematically infiltrated by something their security systems couldn't properly categorize. Flagship capture often causes complete collapse of pirate operations because it represents not just tactical loss but psychological devastation. These vessels serve as mobile headquarters, containing command structures, intelligence databases, and the symbolic heart of pirate authority. Nibble's infiltration methods bypassed all standard anti-boarding protocols. He didn't use breaching charges or cutting tools. He used evolutionary adaptations. His claws found purchase on surfaces that should have been smooth. His persistence overcame locks that should have been impervious. His problem-solving intelligence identified weaknesses in systems that engineers had certified as secure. The pirates had prepared for electronic warfare, for marine boarding actions, for system hacking. They hadn't prepared for biological persistence applied to mechanical problems. The symbolic heart of pirate authority became vulnerable to a terrestrial predator. Command decks that had hosted strategy sessions about dominating shipping lanes now hosted a honey badger investigating control panels. Communications equipment that had coordinated raids across sectors now transmitted the sounds of careful dismantling. The bridge, where Captain Scar had planned countless operations, became just another space to be explored and understood. The invaders found themselves not just losing a ship, but losing their operational identity. The command ship fell to unconventional tactics that rewrote engagement rules. Standard pirate doctrine assumed technological superiority would determine outcomes. They never considered that evolutionary adaptations could defeat advanced security systems. Their assumptions about what constituted a viable threat, size, weaponry, technology, proved completely inadequate against an opponent that used ingenuity and persistence as primary weapons. The honey badger didn't overpower their defenses. He outthought them using neural pathways shaped by millions of years of terrestrial survival pressure. How did a honey badger reclaim control from attackers? By operating outside their understanding of how conflicts work. While the pirates looked for military responses, Nibbles provided biological solutions. Where they expected organized resistance, he offered determined investigation. Their systems were designed to counter threats that followed predictable patterns of escalation and force. They had no answer for an opponent that treated their advanced technology as interesting environmental features to be explored and understood. Which brings us to the moment of ultimate surrender. You know how pirate captains maintain reputation? Scar's surrender statement became legendary humiliation across 3 sectors. His transmission cut through emergency channels with the strained formality of someone signing his own professional obituary. To any Federation vessels in range, we formally surrender to the human child and her demon creature. That specific phrasing would echo through criminal networks for years. becoming shorthand for catastrophic miscalculation. The most feared pirate fleet in the galaxy hadn't just been defeated, they'd been outmaneuvered by opponents their entire worldview couldn't accommodate. Surrendering to a child and her animal represented complete psychological defeat. Military surrender protocols typically acknowledge conventional command structures. Officers, governments, military organizations. They follow established patterns that preserve some dignity even in defeat. By specifically naming Mika and Nibbles, Scar abandoned all pretenses of professional military conduct. He wasn't surrendering to Federation forces or even to the ship's captain. He was acknowledging that an 8-year-old and her companion had dismantled his operation more effectively than any military counter-assault could have. The specific naming cemented their status as legitimate combatants in pirate lore. That designation would follow both of them for decades, creating a reputation that preceded any future encounters. Criminal organizations began circulating warnings about human children traveling with terrestrial animals, treating them with the caution most reserves for armed security details. The surrender statement transformed what should have been a routine kidnapping into a case study in underestimating unconventional threats. Military surrender protocols exist within structured frameworks that allow defeated forces to maintain some semblance of honor. They specify conditions, treatment of prisoners, terms of ceasefire. Scar's surrender offered none of that. Just raw acknowledgement that his professional understanding of conflict had proven utterly inadequate. He wasn't following procedure. He was documenting the collapse of his operational confidence in real time. The statement's blunt honesty made it more devastating than any formal diplomatic communication could have been. The anticipation built around that transmission would shape pirate behavior for generations. New recruits would hear the story during orientation, how the Crimson Claw Syndicate, known for their ruthless efficiency, had been broken by a combination of child curiosity and animal persistence. The statement became a cautionary tale about assumptions, about preparation, about the dangers of treating human family units as soft targets. Pirates began updating their training manuals to include scenarios far outside conventional warfare parameters. They acknowledged defeat by unconventional forces, because continuing the fight meant facing complete annihilation. The honey badger had demonstrated capabilities that their weapons couldn't counter. The child had demonstrated strategic thinking that their training couldn't anticipate. Continuing the engagement would have meant watching their command ship dismantled piece by piece by a creature that treated advanced technology as interesting toys. Surrendering to specifically named opponents at least offered a chance to survive with some record of what had actually happened. Why did the pirate captain surrender to an 8-year-old? Because she and her companion had proven more effective than any military force he'd ever faced. They operated outside his understanding of rules, tactics, and even basic threat assessment. His weapons were useless, his training irrelevant, his experience meaningless against opponents who didn't follow any recognizable pattern of conflict. Surrendering was the only rational choice when facing adversaries whose capabilities defied categorization, but the aftermath would prove even more significant. You know how bureaucracies handle unprecedented events? Admiral Chen faced a reporting nightmare that would make any career officer reconsider their life choices. The official after-action report documented a sequence of events that read like bad science fiction, complete with a child tactical commander and an animal that treated bulkheads as mild suggestions. Conventional battlefield wisdom, developed over centuries of interstellar conflict, couldn't account for honey badger tactical effectiveness. All the standard metrics, weapon power, crew training, defensive capabilities, proved completely irrelevant against opponents operating outside established combat paradigms. The incident forced immediate reassessment of human family units as potential combat entities. Military organizations typically struggle to incorporate unconventional warfare successes into doctrine because they disrupt established hierarchies and threat models. Chen's team had to create entirely new classification categories just to describe what had happened. Their analysts pored over sensor logs, trying to fit honey badger persistence metrics into tactical assessment frameworks designed for evaluating energy weapons and shield technology. The very language of military reporting lacked terms for claw-based system penetration or small mammal psychological warfare. Chen's confirmation of the outcome transitioned the incident from wild anecdote to cautionary legend. By signing off on the official report, she gave bureaucratic legitimacy to events that defied conventional understanding. The documentation process itself became an exercise in redefining reality. Every paragraph challenged another assumption about how conflicts should work. Analysts had to create new data fields for terrestrial predator problem-solving efficiency and child cognitive flexibility under fire. The standard after-action template simply wasn't built for this kind of scenario. The Federation needed to create new categories for this type of threat because the old ones kept failing. Threat assessment databases typically classify risks by technology level, species capabilities, military assets. None of these categories accommodated the particular combination of human-child development and honey badger evolutionary adaptations. Chen's team found themselves writing policy about appropriate engagement distances from 8-year-olds and proper procedures for encountering emotional support. Animals with industrial-grade digging capabilities. They were essentially creating the first interstellar guidelines for not provoking small Earth mammals. What made Admiral Chen update the threat assessment database was the dawning realization that their entire security framework had blind spots big enough to drive a pirate fleet through. The Steady Eddie incident demonstrated that Federation defenses were prepared for every conventional threat, except the most unpredictable one: human creativity combined with evolutionary persistence. Their systems could detect warships, intercept missiles, counter electronic warfare, but they had no protocols for assessing the combat potential of a curious child and her determined companion. The report challenged everything they knew about risk evaluation, threat response, and even basic interstellar etiquette. Military doctrine assumed rational actors following recognizable patterns of conflict. The honey badger doctrine operated on completely different principles: persistence over strategy, adaptation over planning, curiosity over caution. Chen's updates to the database weren't just adding new entries. They were acknowledging that some threats defy categorization because they operate outside established understanding of how the universe should work, which brings us to the new galactic reality. You know how threat levels get assigned? Human cubs received the supernova with abandonment issues designation after the Steady Eddie incident. The Federation's updated threat database included explicit guidance that read like emergency protocols for handling unstable antimatter, where most species' children got classified as non-combatants or protected persons. Human offspring now had their own special category with specific engagement rules. This wasn't just bureaucratic paperwork. It became mandatory reading for every military and security force operating near human settlements. Galactic policy now recognized something previously considered harmless as dangerously unpredictable. The change didn't happen gradually. It slammed into effect like an emergency broadcast. 1 week, children were background elements in passenger manifests. The next, they required specialized threat assessment protocols. Security teams received mandatory training on human developmental psychology alongside weapons certification. The guidance wasn't subtle. Do not engage. Do not threaten. Do not even make prolonged eye contact. That triple warning became standard operating procedure across 3 sectors. Threat classification systems often use metaphorical language for complex risks that defy straightforward description. The supernova analogy captured both the destructive potential and emotional volatility that made human children uniquely challenging. Like stellar explosions, they could appear deceptively calm before releasing enormous energy without warning. The abandonment issues reference acknowledged the protective family dynamics that could trigger disproportionate responses. This wasn't about the children themselves being aggressive. It was about the unpredictable consequences of threatening their secure attachments. The classification would shape interspecies interactions for generations. Merchant captains started requesting additional hazard pay for human child transports. Border security developed specialized screening procedures that minimized direct interaction with young humans. Criminal organizations issued standing orders to avoid jobs involving human families altogether. The reputation spread through word of mouth faster than official channels. Stories about the Steady Eddie became campfire tales told with nervous laughter and sideways glances. Children became classified threats not because they were inherently dangerous, but because their responses to perceived threats operated outside predictable parameters. Human developmental psychology creates cognitive flexibility that conventional threat assessment models can't accommodate. Their problem-solving doesn't follow adult patterns. Their risk calculation differs fundamentally, and their access to unconventional resources like determined terrestrial predators makes them force multipliers in unexpected ways. The classification acknowledged that human children don't respond to intimidation like other species. They respond with creativity, persistence, and sometimes evolutionary backup. The supernova designation meant security forces now treated human children with the cautious respect most reserved for armed combatants. Approaching a lost human child required different protocols than assisting other species young. Security teams maintained safe distances, used indirect communication methods, and avoided sudden movements that might be misinterpreted. The guidelines emphasized that human children shouldn't be approached without parental supervision. And even then, interactions should be minimal and non-confrontational. Why are human children now classified as dangerous? Because they represent unpredictable variables in otherwise calculable risk equations. Their combination of cognitive flexibility, creative problem-solving, and access to unexpected resources makes them wild cards in any conflict scenario. The galaxy learned that cornering a human child doesn't just mean facing the child. It means facing their entire support system, which might include determined honey badgers, inventive parents, or simply the child's own ability to turn environmental elements into strategic advantages. But what did this classification actually mean in practice? You know how supernovas behave unpredictably. The abandonment issues descriptor proved remarkably accurate. Treating human cubs as cosmic phenomena with emotional problems became standard operational guidance across Federation security forces. The classification acknowledged both destructive capability and psychological triggers in equal measure, creating protocols that read like emergency procedures for handling volatile exotic matter. This wasn't about fear. It was about recognizing patterns of response that conventional threat models couldn't capture. Prolonged eye contact could trigger defensive responses similar to territorial threats in predator species. Human children often interpret intense staring as aggression or challenge, especially in unfamiliar environments or when separated from primary caregivers. The guidance specifically advised security personnel to avoid direct visual engagement, recommending peripheral vision monitoring instead. Customs officials received training on approach angles that minimized perceived confrontation while maintaining security observation. The protocols recognized that human children process visual cues differently than most species, interpreting sustained attention as potential threat assessment. The abandonment reference recognized the protective family unit dynamics at play in human psychology. Separation from caregivers triggers heightened alertness and creative problem-solving in human children, unlike the distress responses seen in most species. Where other young might become passive or retreat, human children often become more observant, more inventive, and more likely to engage unconventional resources. The classification acknowledged that threatening a human child didn't just risk encountering the child's defenses, it risked activating their entire support network, which might include parents, companions, or even specially adapted terrestrial animals. This understanding prevented countless future conflicts through simple avoidance strategies. Merchant ships began installing separate viewing areas for human children during customs inspections. Security teams developed non-confrontational screening techniques that used indirect questioning and environmental scanning rather than direct interaction. The protocols emphasized that human children should never be separated from their designated companions during security procedures, recognizing that isolation could trigger the very responses they aimed to prevent. The metaphor guided practical interaction by providing a framework for understanding seemingly irrational responses. Security personnel learned that human children might react to perceived threats with creativity rather than fear, with persistence rather than retreat, with unconventional solutions rather than standard defensive postures. The supernova analogy helped them remember that apparent calm could precede dramatic responses, while the abandonment issues reference reminded them that security depended on maintaining connection rather than enforcing control. What does treat as a supernova with abandonment issues mean? It means maintaining distance while monitoring indirectly. It means avoiding actions that could be interpreted as threatening separation from family or companions. It means recognizing that human children process threats through different cognitive frameworks than adults or other species. Most importantly, it means understanding that the safest approach is often the least interactive one. Observing without engaging, monitoring without confronting, and always maintaining respect for the unpredictable potential contained within human developmental psychology. The classification transformed interstellar security from confrontation management to environmental engineering. Instead of trying to control human children's responses, security forces learned to shape environments that minimize triggers. They designed spaces with clear sight lines to caregivers, implemented procedures that kept family units together, and trained personnel to recognize the early signs of escalating curiosity rather than fear. This preventive approach proved far more effective than reactive measures, which brings us to how this reshaped careers across multiple sectors. The new understanding of human child psychology didn't just change security protocols, it created entirely new professional specializations and career paths. From security consultants specializing in human developmental stages, to ship designers creating child-friendly inspection areas, the ripple effects of that classification reached further than anyone anticipated. You know how military careers take unexpected turns? Rex Murphy became Director of Human Colony Defense after the Steady Eddie incident. His experience with Mika and Nibbles transformed from professional humiliation to specialized expertise almost overnight. Where other captains might have seen a bizarre anomaly to be forgotten, the Federation saw a pattern recognition expert who understood human unpredictability as a strategic asset. They needed veterans who could think beyond conventional threat models, and Rex had just demonstrated he could adapt to realities that broke standard military doctrine. His reluctant babysitting duty became the foundation for planetary defense strategy across 12 human colonies. Military organizations often promote specialists based on unconventional experience, recognizing that sometimes the most valuable insights come from outside standard career paths. Rex's understanding of human family dynamics informed entirely new colony protection protocols that emphasized environmental design over armed response. He advocated for security systems that minimized confrontational interactions and maximized observational capabilities, recognizing that prevention worked better than reaction when dealing with human psychology. The single incident reframed strategic priorities across human settlements. Instead of layering more weapons and armor, defense planning shifted toward creating environments where human creativity could flourish without triggering defensive responses. Rex's teams designed colony layouts with clear sight lines between parents and children, developed non-confrontational security screening procedures, and implemented training programs that emphasized observation over intervention. His approach recognized that the greatest security came from understanding human behavior rather than trying to control it. Rex's career transformed completely because he understood something fundamental about human threat response. Where conventional military thinking saw children as vulnerabilities to be protected, he recognized them as potential force multipliers whose responses could destabilize even professional combatants. His defense plans accounted for the reality that human family units don't behave like other species, social groupings. Their protective instincts operate on different timelines and with different triggering mechanisms. This understanding allowed him to design security systems that worked with human nature rather than against it. How did this incident reshape Rex's military career? It moved him from conventional command roles to specialized advisory positions that didn't even exist before the Steady Eddie. He became the Federation's leading expert on human behavioral security, consulting on everything from starship design to diplomatic protocol. His understanding of how human children process threats influenced security training across multiple sectors, creating a generation of personnel who approached human settlements with different expectations and tactics. The man who thought babysitting duty would end his career found himself shaping interstellar security policy for decades to come. His promotion represented a fundamental shift in how the Federation viewed human capabilities. They stopped seeing human colonies as settlements that needed protection and started recognizing them as complex ecosystems with their own defensive characteristics. Rex's strategies emphasized that security came from understanding rather than control, from adaptation rather than enforcement. His plans accounted for the reality that human children might respond to threats with creativity rather than fear, and that their companions might include resources that conventional security assessments would overlook. But the broader implications reached even further. The recognition that human unpredictability could be a strategic asset, rather than a liability, changed how the Federation approached human integration altogether. Security protocols became less about containment and more about accommodation, less about restriction and more about understanding. Rex's unexpected promotion signaled that the galaxy was finally learning to work with human nature, rather than trying to fit it into existing frameworks. You know how single events change interstellar relations? The Stite Eddy incident reshaped galactic policy almost overnight. Pirates, mercenaries, and even legitimate military forces adjusted engagement rules that had stood for centuries. Standard operating procedures that treated civilian transports as soft targets suddenly acquired new appendixes and special provisions. The guidance wasn't subtle. Human family units required different handling, different function pingu, different everything. What was once considered routine now demanded specialized consideration and often outright avoidance. The previously dismissed human family unit became a calculated risk factor in tactical planning. Where military strategists once saw vulnerable non-combatants, they now recognize potential force multipliers operating outside conventional threat models. Criminal organizations issued standing orders to avoid human children entirely after the story circulated, through underworld networks. The Crimson Claw's humiliation became a cautionary tale told in pirate bars and mercenary lounges across 3 sectors. Policy changes often follow unexpected demonstrations of capability, and few demonstrations were as unexpected as a child and honey badger dismantling a professional boarding operation. The honey badger became symbolic of Earth's philosophical approach to threats. Where other civilizations developed advanced weapons or sophisticated shields, humans apparently cultivated partnerships with persistent predators. The creature's refusal to retreat, its problem-solving intelligence, and its ability to turn environments into weapons represented something fundamental about human strategic thinking. Galactic security experts began studying terrestrial ecology manuals alongside military history texts, searching for patterns in how humans integrate natural capabilities into defensive strategies. This cultural shift prevented conflicts through widespread awareness rather than through force of arms. Merchant captains learned to give human transports wider berths. Customs officials developed non-confrontational inspection protocols. Even legitimate military forces updated their rules of engagement to account for the human tendency to respond to threats with creativity rather than conventional tactics. The understanding spread through anecdotes and official bulletins alike. Human children weren't passive cargo but potential strategic assets whose responses defied prediction. Galactic interaction rules changed permanently because the incident demonstrated that human capabilities operated outside established frameworks. Security protocols expanded to include behavioral assessment, alongside technological scanning. Risk evaluation matrices now included factors like apparent age of human passengers and presence of terrestrial companions. The changes weren't just paperwork, they represented a fundamental shift in how the galaxy understood threat assessment and response. How did this single incident reshape galactic policy? By demonstrating that human unpredictability could defeat technological superiority, that creativity could overcome firepower, and that the most dangerous threats sometimes came in packages that conventional wisdom dismissed as harmless. The policy changes acknowledged that security depended on understanding psychology as much as technology, on recognizing that some civilizations developed capabilities that didn't fit neat classification systems. The honey badger's persistence became a metaphor for human resilience, while the child's curiosity represented human adaptability. Together, they forced a re-evaluation of what constituted a viable threat in modern space conflicts. Military academies added case studies on unconventional warfare that focused on cognitive flexibility rather than weapons technology. Security consultants began offering specialized services in human behavioral assessment and threat mitigation. The policy shifts reached beyond military applications into commercial and diplomatic spheres. Trade agreements began including clauses about handling human family members during inspections. Immigration protocols developed specialized processing for human children that minimized separation and confrontation. The changes recognized that human security depended on maintaining connection and stability rather than enforcing control and separation. Which brings us to the enduring legacy. The policy changes didn't just affect how the galaxy interacted with humans, they changed how humans viewed themselves within the galactic community. The recognition that their children required special classification became a source of amusement and pride. Another example of human exceptionalism that simultaneously confused and impressed their interstellar neighbors. The rules would stand for generations, updated and refined but never fundamentally challenged, because everyone remembered what happened when you underestimated human cubs and their companions. You know how animals represent planetary characteristics? Honey badgers became ambassadors of human philosophy without anyone officially appointing them. The message spread through interstellar channels without formal diplomatic notes. Don't mess with our families and we won't mess with your civilization. This understanding emerged not from treaty negotiations but from practical experience. The Steady Eddie incident demonstrated that human protective instincts extended beyond immediate family, to include whatever creatures they considered part of their social unit. This blurred the lines between pet partner and strategic asset in ways the galaxy struggled to categorize. Earth's wildlife, previously seen as primitive or decorative, now represented strategic deterrence. Where other civilizations developed energy shields or plasma weapons, humans had apparently cultivated partnerships with persistent predators. Zoological databases that were once academic curiosities became required reading for security personnel. Animal handlers found themselves consulting with tactical planners about terrestrial predator capabilities. The honey badger's specific traits, persistence, fearlessness, problem-solving, became symbolic of humanity's broader approach to challenges. Other species started re-evaluating their assumptions about what constituted advanced civilization. Other Terran predators received renewed respect in galactic circles. Security briefings began including sections on bear behavior, big cat hunting strategies, and even migratory bird patterns. The understanding spread that human interactions with wildlife followed different patterns than other species' animal management approaches. Where most civilizations domesticated creatures for specific utilities, humans seemed to form partnerships based on mutual respect and shared territory. This philosophical difference suddenly carried strategic implications that affected everything from trade, negotiations to border security. Animal symbolism often carries cultural and philosophical meaning between civilizations. The honey badger became more than an animal. It represented humanity's refusal to back down, their creative problem-solving, and their willingness to form alliances across species boundaries. Military analysts studied terrestrial ecology alongside combat manuals, searching for patterns in how humans integrated natural capabilities into their defensive strategies. The creature's persistence against larger opponents became metaphorical for human resilience against overwhelming odds. Its ability to turn environments into weapons reflected human ingenuity under pressure. The emotional support animal concept gained dangerous new interpretations. What other species saw as psychological comfort, humans might be using as strategic preparation. Documentation that listed creatures as therapeutic companions now required additional verification and risk assessment. Customs officials developed protocols for evaluating whether an animal was truly for emotional support or represented a more practical partnership. The paperwork might say anxiety reduction, but security teams learned to check the creature's claws, teeth, and problem-solving capabilities before making assumptions. This understanding created a protective reputation for human settlements that worked better than any defense fleet. Criminal organizations gave human colonies wider berths. Merchant captains requested hazard pay for routes through human space. The knowledge that any human child might be traveling with a determined companion changed risk calculations across multiple industries. Security costs decreased not because of better weapons, but because potential threats decided human systems weren't worth the unpredictable consequences. Animals became diplomatic assets through demonstrated capability rather than formal appointment. The honey badger didn't need an ambassadorial title. Its actions communicated everything necessary about human values and capabilities. This shift toward practical demonstration over formal negotiation characterized humanity's broader approach to interstellar relations. They preferred showing rather than telling, proving rather than promising. Their wildlife ambassadors operated on the same principle. Actions spoke louder than diplomatic notes, How did Earth's wildlife become philosophical ambassadors? By demonstrating that human relationships with other species followed different patterns than galactic norms. Where others saw domination or domestication, humans practiced partnership and mutual adaptation. Their creatures represented not controlled assets, but extended family members whose capabilities became part of collective security. This understanding forced the galaxy to reconsider what advanced civilization really meant. Not just technological achievement, but the quality of relationships across species boundaries. But the personal impact endured most significantly.